come from the bowels of hell.
The Dana Gould Hour.
Jungle worms and swamp rats run around your feet.
I bought a dog that killed the calf that ate the canary. What is truth?
And once again, welcome back.
Spring has sprung. The days are turning warm and sunny here at Falcon's Lair Recording Studios, high atop the Mulholland Drive view shelf, here in sunny Southern California. We have two guests today. It's an old-school double-shot episode. Our old buddy Kliph Nesteroff is here to talk about his new book, We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, the unheralded story of Native Americans and comedy. It is an incredible story, all true. It is a must-read for comedy fans. And we also have one of the people Kliph writes about in the book, Bobby Wilson, who is a comedian and a writer and performer in the group The 1491s. We also have True Tales from Weirdsville and all sorts of delights and surprises. As for me, well, the world is creeping back to life, but live performing is still on the slow, as the kids say. And I have nothing to report on that front, but on May 7th at 5 o'clock on Turner Classic Movies, the live read of Plan 9 from Outer Space is being broadcast as part of this year's TCM Film Festival. That's Friday, May 7th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern on TCM, Plan 9 from Outer Space live with this cast: Deborah Baker Jr., Maria Bamford, Bobcat Goldthwait, me, David Koechner, Lorraine Newman, Oscar Nunez, Bob Odenkirk, Jonah Ray, Paul F. Tompkins, Janet Varney, Baron Vaughn, Gary Anthony Williams, Kat Augustin, music by Eben Schletter, and miniature special effects by Mike Carano. Friday, May 7th on Turner Classic Movies, Plan 9 from Outer Space live. Now, before we get on the show, allow me to annoy you one last time, for this episode anyway, about our Patreon. If you're not a Patreon member, I'd like to invite you to go to danagould.com and please sign up. Our Patreon is what allows me to keep making the show. Just $5 a month, you get the title Dana Gould Hour Sky Cadet, and you get some stuff. You get extra audio content, you get extra video content. $5. We don't have gradated levels. For $71.50 a month, I'm not going to come to your house and chase your granny around the yard with a hose. $5 a month, become a Sky Cadet, and you get some stuff. Okay, enough of that. And now, it is on to our filthy business.
Tune in, it's a gas. It's the Dana Gould Hour podcast.
The Dana Gould Hour. Free and worth it.
My guest today is an old friend and a dear friend, and he is the author of the excellent book, the indispensable book, The Comedians, History of Stand-Up Comedy, and he has a new book out called We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, which is the fascinating history of the comedy of indigenous peoples here in America. Stand-up comedy is a uniquely American art form, and yet people do not associate it with the most uniquely American people, and yet they have a rich and fascinating history of it. Please welcome Kliph Nesteroff.
This is the sound of my voice.
Hey, man. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Why, I haven't spoken to you since yesterday. But this is an interesting book, because when you first told me about this book like a year ago, what you were working on, I thought, I was like, what a great idea. How did this come to me? You're not indigenous.
No.
you're not even American.
No, that's
You're
true
Canadian.
too. But that is part
You're a
of the,
Canadian.
But that is part of the crux of it. In Canada, First Nations issues are like on the front pages every single day. And if you go to the Globe and Mail or the CBC's website, you'll see the tabs at the top that say international news, sports, business, and then Indigenous. There's always a tab for Indigenous news, and that doesn't really exist in the United States. And I always thought that was strange. When I moved here 10 years ago, I was like, so there's just no Indigenous representation in media, in the press, in show business. And in Canada, there's a lot more. So I always thought that was a weird disparity, especially when you come to Hollywood and you constantly hear about diversity, and yet it marginalizes large sections of people that are not included in that. So this book was sort of an attempt to educate the non-native reader and also to try and elevate some voices. I know it sounds so pretentious, but my last book was successful, and so I have the opportunity to use the platform for maybe something good. When I got this book contract,
look, as a comedy practitioner, but also as a amateur stand-up comedy historian and nerd, it was I remember Charlie Hill, right? But it was one of those things you're like, oh yeah, what about this? And they always did. The Indigenous peoples in American pop culture have had as raw a deal as anyone.
Yeah.
It's like the deal does not get rawer than and
it almost goes without saying, but for some reason it has to be said in this day and age, because if we saw any sitcom or movie or cartoon that had blackface, we would, even you and I understanding the historical context, we're not going to be like losing our minds, but still we'll be like, well, there's fucking blackface. Like that's hardcore. And that is not something you would ever do today or even in the last 60 years. But when it comes to parodying Native American,
brown face, as they say, or red
everything,
face.
Everything is like fair game. And if you complain about it or say, hey, that's racist, immediately somebody's being like, not racist. I'm like, well, if blackface is racist, why would it not be racist when you're defaming another race of people? Obviously, it's the same thing, more or less. So, and people don't really see that. They still, because the dehumanization process of dehumanizing Native peoples and presenting them as less than human who don't matter, that has had such a successful effect on the minds of non-Native people that people still think that way, that it's okay to have a racial slur as the name of a football team is still considered acceptable to a huge swath of the population. You would never, ever name a sports team after the N-word. So, I mean, it's
sure.
Without saying, but got to say it.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And the interesting thing in the book, and then I want to get into the most famous Native American Indigenous person comedian that people don't even know is an Indigenous person.
Yeah.
But there's the belief that Americans didn't think that Indigenous peoples were funny because every time they saw them on television, they were either crying at garbage or in a TV show being very stoic.
Yeah.
And very, many moon come Choctaw.
Yeah, exactly.
And 9 times out of 10, those weren't Indigenous peoples playing those roles. They were Jews and Italians in wigs.
Right. Absolutely true.
I mean, I give you F troop.
Yeah. The weird thing is like,
but Scar in The Searchers, is it Scar in The Searchers?
I don't remember his character's name now,
but he was an Italian guy. It's just ridiculous.
all that stuff. The funny thing is that in the late 60s, there was this recalibration. The old stereotype was as the Native American villain. And then late 60s, it became the opposite, like the all-knowing, in tune with nature, super wise. And so in a way, the little big man era was trying to have like a progressive point of view. Oh, we've wronged Native peoples. Yet we're going to hire Chuck Connors to play Geronimo. Or we're going to get Robert Blake and tell them Willie Boy is here, with an all-white cast, an all-white crew, all-white scriptwriter, all-white directors, everything all white, but with this new sympathy because they had read a book or something, So it was they were going new direction, trying to be more understanding, but not engaging with any indigenous peoples whatsoever. So
it was a patronizing awareness.
Yeah.
You've got a problem. Let me explain it.
Yeah, and that still happens to this day. Like
White-splaining.
I went and saw the 1491s perform in Oregon, and they were playing the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which was a pretty white event.
Those who don't know, the 1491s are
an all-native sketch troupe, 5 dudes: Sterling Harjo, Dallas Goldtooth, Bobby Wilson, Ryan Redcorn, and McGeezy Pensano. 5 super talented, super funny dudes.
Sterling 1491 being the year before
Columbus arrived. They rue the day that they chose that name because they're constantly introduced as the 1942s,
perfect
56s. People just don't. But I went and saw them at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival do this hilarious sketch comedy thing that they had written. And these, NPR listening white liberal people that showed up are still like, "Oh, you have such beautiful hair. Let me touch your hair." This total ownership sort of attitude, pandering, white people really don't put in the effort, whether they're a right winger or a left winger. Nobody bothers to educate or inform themselves. They think they know things, and it's got to be frustrating for any indigenous person. But yeah,
and I'm going to do the middle piece about F Troop. No, I'm kidding.
Good. I don't mind. I did a thing with Gilbert where we talked quite a bit about F Troop, and it was a good conversation because they love F Troop, Gilbert and his co-host Frank. And I didn't grow up watching F Troop. I grew up watching Gilligan's Island, which basically is the same show with a different setting, right? So I love that stuff too. And I love Larry Storch and I love Bernie Capel. But even if you talk to Bernie Capel, who's still alive, he'll go, "Yeah, I played the Italian, I played the Irishman, I played the Indian, but we don't need to do that today." He himself can concede that that's of that era. The same way we used to say blackface was of its era. It is. They made an Adam Sandler movie like in 2015. It was maybe still to this day, the most downloaded or streamed Netflix thing ever, called The Ridiculous Six. And it was basically F Troop, but made in 2015 and starring Adam Sandler. And I don't even think that movie could be made today, even 5-6 years later.
Well, I worked on Tropic Thunder, which you couldn't do today. I don't think Robert Downey Jr.'s role could be.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, you couldn't. You couldn't. And even Billy Crystal, when they had him pinch hit as the host of the Oscars, Eddie Murphy got fired because Brett Ratner had used the word fag. And so they fired him. And then in emergency replacement, they hired Billy Crystal to host the Oscars again.
What year was this?
Like 2012 or something.
Oh, gosh.
And it was basically watching the Oscars in the 80s, except in the year 2012, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And Billy Crystal did his blackface. It's not blackface, but like bronzed jazz musician. And it didn't age well, man. Like it was like a big thing in the 80s, and we never blinked an eye. But it's sort of like, we know people like this from having done stand-up. There's a dude who you used to do stand-up with, then he quits. He comes back like 10 years later, tries to get back in it, and he's doing the jokes from 15 years ago that he used to kill, and now they just don't land at all. And he keeps trying, and they just don't land at all. There's something about that passage of time where comedy just stops being.
But there is that element that people have to go, this was okay then. When Billy Crystal played Sammy Davis Jr. on Saturday Night Live, it was okay then.
Yeah.
It's not now.
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you. Tastes change, awareness changes. Nowadays, I don't think anyone would do it, but back then, no one thought twice about it.
In the 1950s, there was a very similar controversy happening as is happening now. And people kind of, when they don't know history, it's easy for them to say, "Oh, this never happened before," or "People didn't get offended back in those days," or "People are too sensitive now." In the 50s, blackface stopped being used in movies around 1944, 45. After black servicemen returned as heroes, it was considered an insult to continue defaming them in show business. So blackface went away from the movies. But old school minstrel performers said, "This is my livelihood. This is
Sure.
entertainment. This is show business. How dare you? And there was a big debate, believe it or not, about blackface in the 50s, where people said, well, if you want to stay in the game, you got to change your act. And these other dudes who were like, this has been my act for 50 fucking years. I'm not about to change it now. So there was this big debate. The Saturday Evening Post published an editorial in 1958 about how there was too many taboos and you couldn't joke about anything anymore.
In
Can't
1958.
58, yeah. So this debate has been existing forever. It's not new. And, calling it cancel culture might be new, but this sort of war between people who feel they're being disrespected and those who make a livelihood reporting a style of show business or comedy that is sometimes considered disrespectful, that debate has been going on forever. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist, in 1848, he said that blackface comedians were, quote, the filthy scum of white society, profiting off of black people. 1848.
Wow.
100 years before blackface is
only Bob Hope was still doing comedy back then.
Yeah. And in this new book, I actually tell a story about the year 1911 when a group of indigenous leaders met with President William Howard Taft. The year 1911, they said these silent movies that are coming out, these Western movies, are full of racist stereotypes and historical distortions, and we'd like it to stop because it'll serve as harmful propaganda otherwise. The year 1911, 3 years before Chaplin becomes famous, and 4 years before Birth of a Nation is even made.
Right, yeah.
Native Americans are protesting against the way they are being depicted film. I mean, that is incredible. The fact that 110 years ago, the same debate is happening that's happening today. And it's only now that some people are maybe starting to wake up a little bit and thinking, okay, maybe I, as a white person, am not the all be all in terms of deciding whether something is racist or not.
Exactly. And I'm certainly, I think anybody who's been on stage has said things and done things that now like, oh, I couldn't do that today. I couldn't do that today. There's also a large part of people who say that, white culture is being eaten away at and sold down the river. Part of their complaint is that it is no longer cool for them to demean other cultures. It's you always hear that, say like, oh, so black people can say the N-word, but I can't. I hear it on the radio. Yes. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
They can say it, and you can't. You got it. What's the problem?
Yeah. Why would you want to say it? But that argument is very much like a Pat Buchanan classic type of argument. The idea of white culture being under attack. It's weird to me. It
was the same in the 1848 to 1960 to it's these things. They work for a reason. People buy into them for a reason. Victimization is a tonic.
I never thought that Ku Klux Klanism and neo-Nazism, the only thing apparently that kept it from being mainstream was the wardrobe. Because now Nazis don't dress like Nazis and Klansmen don't wear
they've had a nice update.
Yeah, they got the hipster beards now, and so suddenly people
as I said,
he makes good points.
Yeah. If you look at the march in Charlottesville, they've gone from the sheets and stuff to those 3-button sports shirts, buttoned all the way to the top.
Yeah,
and tucked into khakis. They've gone from scary ghost to furious toddler on picture day. It's like a terribly unfuckable look.
I during my last book tour in 2015, when the comedians came out, I was wearing a fedora, as I often do. I dated a milliner, and she made me a fedora, and so I got into that look.
Who hasn't, Kliph?
But a woman came up to me at a literary event, and she was very hostile. She goes, "Are you a men's rights activist?" I went, "What? What does that even mean?" She goes, "Your hat. That's the logo of the men's rights activists. They wear the tilted fedora." And I was like, oh my God. So like I was signaling some sort of neo-fascist allegiance.
No, my head's cold.
No, I'm okay. I flashed the okay sign. I'm okay. What are you talking about?
Exactly. I flashed at waist level. Oh my God. No, that's crazy. But what is interesting about one of the most famous humorists in American culture
Yes.
is an indigenous person, and people didn't know it, including me, and that is
Will Rogers. Yeah, Will Rogers is a name that everybody knows. You hear it all the time. They've named hospitals, museums, parks. There's a beach in Malibu. All these things named after.
That's right.
Will
There
Rogers.
is a beach in Malibu.
Yeah, and I'm sure you could.
And
come up with
isn't Will Rogers State Park? Isn't that where George?
Reeves.
No, the guy from Wham.
Oh, the bathroom. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
George
It's-
Michael. George
yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's a state park. I think it's Will
That's
Rogers.
that's just a little park in Beverly Hills. Will Rogers Park. Yeah.
That little park, it was dedicated in 1952 by George Jessel, who gave a little eulogy type thing about Will Rogers when they named that park. I'll get into that in a second, but there's a reason that park is named after Will Rogers and the reason it happened in 1952. But Will Rogers was Native American. He was Cherokee. He was not a white guy claiming to be Cherokee, which is the most common thing in the world even today, where people go, well, I'm 1/16th Cherokee and I'm not offended by the football team name. It's like, no, you're not. You're a white person.
Okay, Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But Will Rogers was Cherokee. He was on the authenticated rolls of the Cherokee Nation in 1887 when they started. The year that Will Rogers was born, 1879, is the same era that the roots of American comedy are being established in vaudeville, largely by formerly enslaved people and Jewish immigrants, also Irish immigrants, and Italian immigrants. Native Americans are not involved in the inception of vaudeville. And the reason is that at the same time, the 1870s, the 1880s, indigenous people were being rounded up whole scale and placed on reservations by the U.S. military, held at gunpoint, forced onto reservations. If you leave, you're arrested, you're killed, or you're brought back to the reservation. So you cannot exercise free will as an indigenous person in America in the 1870s and 1880s. And this is the context in which Will Rogers is born. The Cherokee had more freedom of mobility. They were part of something they called the Five Tribes, which the government considered the most white-like Native Americans. So they gave them more freedom movement. But anyways, Will Rogers was raised in what later became Oklahoma. It was called Indian Territory at the time. It's where people under President Andrew Jackson, were forcibly pushed to in the Trail of Tears. So when Will Rogers was born,
as George Carlin said, when they needed their rights the most, the government said, right this way.
Yeah. Will Rogers' grandfather actually colluded. He was one of the few Cherokee to collude with the Andrew Jackson government and said, okay, we'll take your deal and we'll willingly move to what later became Oklahoma in exchange for land and money. The majority of Cherokee said, no, we are not going anywhere. And then over the course of the next 6 years, that's when the Trail of Tears started and people were forcibly moved and 25% died along the way. So by the time that the survivors of the Trail of Tears landed in the area where Will Rogers' grandfather lived, there was this class distinction and this hostility. And so in 1842, Will Rogers' grandfather was murdered in a vengeance killing for betraying the Cherokee.
Okay.
And his father was just a boy at the time. His father became a prosperous Cherokee rancher because they were granted all this extra land because they had agreed to the terms of moving under the President Jackson administration.
They took the deal.
Yeah. So by the time Will Rogers was born, he was born into a wealthy Cherokee ranching family. They had 5,000 acres of land. They had all this cattle. They would take it to the stockyards in St. Louis. But then in 1887, they passed something called the Allotment Act, which limited the amount of land that indigenous people could have to 160 acres maximum per family. So the Will Rogers Ranch went from being a 5,000 acre ranch to a 160 acre ranch, and their fortune was neutralized. The land
and what was the origin of that? We just don't want them getting too rich and too powerful?
No, they discovered oil on the land where they sent the native people to. So now oil industry, railroad interests.
I was just wondering. I mean, I knew they were getting fucked. I just wanted to know how.
I mean, still the same thing that happens today with any pipeline dispute. It's like the government is going to help industry exploit the resources, and anybody in their path be damned.
Sure.
So, and that's the context Will Rogers is born.
They even have a
into.
fancy name for they even have a fancy name for it. It sounds so nice when you say eminent domain. It's like, well, no, it's eminent domain, please. It's eminent domain.
I mean, I talk about a lot of heavy issues in this book as well as about comedy, but like the Doctrine of Discovery is something that I get into, which is something that everybody should know about. You cannot understand American history or Canadian history without looking into what the Doctrine of Discovery is. Back in the 15th century, Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, and England all invoked the Doctrine of Discovery. Doctrine of Discovery said that if you were an explorer from one of those countries and you landed on a continent, even if it was inhabited by 5 million people, if they weren't Christian, then they no longer had title to the land, and the ownership of the land automatically reverted to the host country of the explorer. That is the basis on which Canada and several other countries, Australia, New Zealand, sometimes the United States, defends themselves in court whenever there's a land dispute. When Indigenous people say, you cannot build a pipeline through here, this is our land, we've never ceded this land, there's no treaty. Canadian government.
You believe in a different, unfortunately, you believe in a different invisible giant than we do.
Yeah, exactly. So the Doctrine of Discovery, right up until very recently, was still used as the defense whenever there was a land dispute. So there's all kinds of like.
So you're saying that white people have done some shady things in history. Huh? I'm going to have to table this.
But anyways, Will Rogers.
Jury's still out. It's amazing.
But
so
anyways,
Will
Rogers becomes the most famous.
The turn of the century, early 1900s, correct? I mean, he had many. I never met a man I didn't like was him, and I'm not a member of any organized party. I'm a Democrat. Those were the two quotes from Will Rogers that I remember the most.
It's the weird thing that they always say, "Oh, he's a great humorist, a great wit," and then what's the example? Never met a man I didn't like. Wait, where's the joke part? Where's the wit? Where's the?
It's a good attitude, though.
But you still hear that cited. Like I'm sure.
It's also was George Michael's defense when he was arrested in Will Rogers Park. Full circle, baby.
I'm sure you could do a good Chris Matthews impression of him referencing Will Rogers. I never met a man I didn't like, because that's kind of, before I researched Will Rogers, my context was like people like Chris Matthews, like name dropping Will Rogers during some political.
Chris Matthews is just narrating a fever dream. Donkey Jaws. What?
That's what Will Rogers said. Yeah,
exactly.
But the reason I Never Met a Man I Didn't Like became famous, again, it has to do with the year 1952, which I'm leading up to, which I think is interesting, and I didn't include in the book, but I want to talk about it. But Will Rogers is considered like the first major political comedian. He was he was a performer in vaudeville. He did rope tricks in vaudeville. He had done rodeos. Coming out of Cherokee ranching culture, that's what he knew. He was taught how to do rope tricks from a formerly enslaved person. His family had 2 slaves. Will Rogers was raised with his family's slaves, learned how to do rope tricks from one of them. There's a lot of weird racial, not Native American related specifically, but racial politics involved in the Rogers family when it comes to African Americans.
Sure.
And, Will Rogers received his first horse when he was 8 years old. It was a black Pinto, and he named it the N-word. His horse was named the N-word. So there's a lot of baggage with Will Rogers as well.
Wow.
But in the 20s, he became a huge Broadway star doing his vaudeville act in the Ziegfeld.
And that horse, that very horse.
Well, he did perform, not with that horse, but he did perform with a horse in vaudeville, which blows my mind. That, could you imagine doing stand-up and having to tour around the country, and you got to bring a horse with you? You got to put a horse in the green room at the Comedy Store.
I think Gallagher has it tough.
Just blows my mind how many horse acts there were in the days of days of vaudeville. But Will Rogers, his political style, like he would do political comedy, it was sort of gentle, but his political point of view was informed by this sort of witnessing of injustice in his youth. Right. You cannot separate the fact that he's Cherokee from the fact that he's Will Rogers, yet throughout history, that's exactly what's happened. It's like he was considered the white, all-American, simple, homespun cowboy. Yeah.
He was Lonesome Rhodes.
A simplistic, simple. Like if somebody, he
was the common clay.
They're calling him a basic bitch. is what they're referring to Will Rogers when they say it's simple, but it's a weird thing. Like if anybody called us, I'm sure people do call us simple, but I mean, it's like an insult. It's not a compliment.
Right.
But Will Rogers being born,
but there
Native
is that.
American
But
in
that's
the
a very
1800s.
But that's a very American. You know, the Roseanne, like that's the whole deplorables. The deplorables. I'm just a simple guy. That's why I don't like doctors. They're too smart. You know, it's
also it's that whole thing of
the wisdom and a lack of wisdom.
Well, like George Washington, I cannot tell a lie. Cuts down a cherry tree. For generations, that's all you knew about George Washington was this fake version of George Washington. Right. Same thing with Will Rogers. Will Rogers never met a man he didn't like. The simple homespun goes, you know, if you're Native American born in the 1800s and then you go on to be the most famous performer in the world, what's simple about that? That's the most complicated, nuanced backstory imaginable.
Well, yeah, that was always, I mean, a weird parallel is I never really took to people making jokes about Arnold Schwarzenegger being dumb. Mm-hmm. Here's a guy, comes to this country, English is his second language, becomes the most famous bodybuilder in the world, decides to become an actor, becomes the biggest movie star in the world, decides to run for governor of California, becomes the governor of California, and our take on him is he's dumb.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a common thing. Like the English speaker who speaks no second language communicating with somebody who can speak two languages, maybe broken, and you think they're the stupid one.
Sure, yeah.
Because you yourself have never put in any effort to learn a second language. Yeah, exactly. It's the great American irony. But when Will Rogers died, and this is the thing that I point out in my book, is that Will Rogers talked about being indigenous all the time. In his act and in his columns, he uses the collective we Indians, us Cherokee. He never for 1 second pretends
denied
to be anything else. Yeah. And it's just never been curated and put in one spot before all this commentary. The fact that he was born and raised in the world of Cherokee ranching and how that informed his worldview is, to me, inseparable from the fact that he becomes this monumental political commentator. But it was basically erased after he died.
Yeah, that is. And it was almost like people didn't want to know. They didn't want to deal with it. Like, or they assumed that he was half Cherokee and it was romantic.
Yeah, exactly. You know? It was like a piece of trivia, the same way that Elizabeth Warren would use it as a piece of trivia. You know, my family told me that. But Will Rogers had connections to the people, to the community, to the land, to the upbringing, to all of it, and so did all of his relatives. But he died in 1935.
That gives you great wisdom because you know you have no illusions about the fair deal you're going to get from the government. You don't have any other.
That's absolutely right. He was always skeptical. And then in 1935, he died famously in a fiery plane crash, which was, probably the most famous news story of 1935. Then in 1952,
with Buddy Holly. No, I'm kidding.
The big bopper, the little bopper.
That was his Cherokee name.
Yeah, Bopper Senior. In 1952, Warner Brothers comes out with a movie called The Will Rogers Story, starring Will Rogers Jr. Will Rogers Jr., by his own admission, was not funny, had no ability for show business, but he looked exactly like Will Rogers, his dad, sounded exactly like Will Rogers, his dad. And so Warner Brothers had been pressuring him for years. We want you to star in the Will Rogers Story. Columbia Pictures had made the Jolson Story and Jolson Sings Again, which were big hits. And then Warner Brothers.
Who played Jolson in the Jolson Story?
I feel really stupid not knowing.
Let's just look it up. Let's just look it up. Do we both have phones? Jolson Story cast.
Bert.
Larry Parks.
Oh, Larry Parks, not Bert Parks. Sorry.
But okay. William Demarest was in it. Larry Parks, William Demarest, Ludwig Donath. Mm.
Yeah, Larry Parks is Betty Garrett's husband. He was blacklisted. Right. Yeah. So the Jolson Story and Jolson Sings Again were so incredibly successful that it created this biopic trend in Hollywood briefly where they would, they wanted to do biopics of old show business people. There was Seven Little Foys starring Bob Hope. There was the Eddie Cantor Story, which was a big bomb starring Keith Brazell.
Man of a Thousand Faces.
Man of a Thousand Faces, sure, yeah. The Lon Chaney biopic, Jimmy Cagney. So the Will Rogers story stars Will Rogers Jr. 1952. At the time, movies are competing with television, of course.
Right.
So this is around the era that 3D is being introduced, then CinemaScope and widescreen. So to promote the Will Rogers story, Warner Brothers went on this huge push to sort of do all these things. They renamed Route 66 the Will Rogers Highway as part of the publicity. It didn't really stick. This is when they dedicated that park where George Michael got busted. Rogers.
Where George Michael met a man he didn't like, a Vice Squad police officer.
Georgie Jessel did some sort of like introduction. Oh, through the annals of history, through the vaudeville of the day, the Weymouth man, a Cherokee man, Will Rogers Park, Will Rogers State Beach, which is just up the highway, not far from where he had his estate, also named for that in 1952. And at the same time, the U.S. Postal Service issues a commemorative Will Rogers stamp, and they wanted to put a quote on the stamp from him. So they found an old quote from one of his routines, from one of his newspaper columns in the late 1920s, and ellipsed it, cut it way down, took it out of context, put it on the stamp. The phrase was, "Never met a man I didn't like." That phrase became famous in 1952 because of the postage stamp, not because of Will Rogers having said it.
Yeah, and now I'm curious as to what the full statement was. I've never met a man, therefore.
The full statement was a running gag in his newspaper columns where it was mock epitaphs. And he said, "When I die, I want my great headstone to say, ba-da-ba, da-da-da, da-da-da." A lot of the jokes don't carry because there are references to things he was doing at the time in the 20s.
Right, sure, yeah.
So one of them, he played Ichabod Crane in some silent movie. So one of the epitaphs was like a joke about how his movie bombed, something about Ichabod Crane, which wouldn't make sense today.
And again, like I never met a man I didn't like is a broken record. Parodied in Planet of the Apes. When Charlton Heston is escaping Ape City and he sneaks into the ape funeral, the minister goes, "The dear departed once said to me, I never met an ape I didn't like."
Yeah, it really gained traction in that period, specifically late 50s, all throughout the 60s and 70s. You heard it over and over and over, but it was, how Don Rickles, when he would do his act, he would insult everybody. And then at the end, and then at the end of his act, he'd go, "We're all friends here. And
I'm a nice guy.
Yeah. If I could bring a little bit of levity, bring us closer together by showing our differences," he would do this maudlin thing. That's what I Never Met a Man I Didn't Like was. It was the maudlin bow at the end of this longer routine that was joke. So it was never meant to be funny, but it's used as an example of his.
Yeah, it would be as if Don Rickles' epitaph was, "He was a nice guy."
Yeah. He was known for being a nice guy and singing that. Yeah. He was known as a great singer of the song, "I'm a Nice Guy." Yeah, exactly. Totally taken out of context. And then James Whitmore, the actor in the 70s, he ripped
also in Planet of the Apes. Sorry, you
Oh, please, by all means, anytime there's an ape.
He was the ape selling Miracle Grow.
And Martha Ray showed up with some denture cream.
Exactly.
And June Allison with some diapers.
Claude Akins drove by with a poppy seed. Ouch!
That was a real trend there for a while in the 80s, the elderly celebrity. But James Whitmore ripped off Hal Holbrook. Hal Holbrook was doing the Mark Twain one-man show. So James Whitmore was like, "I'm going to do a Will Rogers one-man show." And today, a lot of they
run forever, those things. You can book them anywhere. It's a cast of one.
Yeah, exactly. And they're always corny. You could do it on the 4th of July somewhere.
Brian Dennehy did that, but he did it with Crap's Last Tape. He did like a weird, obscure Beckett play. Like he was Brian Dennehy was such a theater motherfucker that he was like, "No, I'll do the hardest Beckett plays you've ever seen."
Oh, that's amazing. Did you know that Mantan Moreland starred in Waiting for Godot? There's like a obscure version, an all-black version of Waiting for Godot in the late 50s that
No, and I didn't know about Soul, which you just posted about.
Yeah, man. The Laugh-In spinoff that never was. The all-black Laugh-In with Slappy White, George Kirby, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Red Fox, Gregory Hines when he was in a team with his dad, Hines and Dad, Chambers Brothers. Yeah, that's a fun and interesting special.
Was it just a pilot?
Yeah, just a pilot. And George Schlatter said that NBC was too afraid of doing an all-black variety show, so they just didn't pick it up. They did air it once, and it got critical praise for having this all-black cast. It was very interesting. This guy H.B. Barnum was the musical director, and if you get into old records from the 60s and 70s, one of the most unsung producer arrangers is this guy H.B. Barnum, who had done, I think he was the producer on Wonderful World for Sam Cooke, was like one of his hits. But he put out all this great music. The music in that special is really great, and is directed by a guy named Mark Warren, the first black member of the Directors Guild, or at least the Television Directors Guild. Came down from Toronto, where he was directing CBC. Sammy Davis Jr. knew him, put him in touch with George Schlatter. He came down, he directed that special, Soul, the all-black Laugh-In, and when it didn't get picked up, then Schlatter hired him as one of the main directors on Laugh-In. So one of the first black TV directors.
Oh, good for Jim. I mean, good for George.
Yeah,
and him.
Yeah. Mark Warren was the guy's name.
Yeah, good for George, good for Mark.
I was going to say, before I forget, James Whitmore did the one-man show of Will Rogers, and a lot of the famous quotes associated with Will Rogers, he never said. But James Whitmore said them in the one-man show about Will Rogers.
That's amazing.
Yeah. They had to punch it up because they felt that his material wasn't traveling for this Broadway show. The audience just wasn't getting, so they had to make it funnier. So one of the famous ones that Will Rogers never said, but that James Whitmore as Will Rogers did say, was, "We have the best Congress money can buy." That is often attributed to Will Rogers, but he never said it in real life.
Did he say the one that I quoted, that I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat? That's one I believe that is attributed to him as well.
Yeah, it's attributed to him. I think he did say that.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, but that happens a lot, is that people confuse people see pictures of, here's the worst analogy ever. People see pictures of Val Kilmer and think it's Jim Morrison.
No, it's true. In Pulp Fiction, that monologue that Samuel L. Jackson does about the Bible, it isn't in the Bible. Like, it's a famous Bible quote.
See, I didn't know that.
Famous Bible quote written by Quentin Tarantino.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's fucking amazing. So let's move it up after Will Rogers, who, as you said, what I didn't realize is he was so famous when he passed away. All the flags were at half-mast.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge deal when he died. He was really,
and he was died of a plane crash, so he was taken away.
He was one of the most famous. His whole family was haunted by tragedy. You know, he dies in a horrific plane crash. He had a baby that died when they were still an infant. His mother died when he was 10. His father tried to have two of his sister's boyfriends murdered. His grandfather was murdered in that vengeance killing.
Right.
And then years later...
Why did they want to have their boyfriends murdered?
It was a different era. It was a different era. You know, you had to ask your father's permission, you know. And then...
You had to ask your girlfriend's father's permission to not murder you.
Yes, please. I beg of you. And then Will Rogers Jr. ended up killing himself, and then Will Rogers' grandson killed himself. Like, it's just a horrific family tree of tragedy. And that horrific plane crash in 1935 was a big deal because at that point, Will Rogers had entered talking motion pictures. He was under contract to Fox. So he and Shirley Temple were the two big box office draws. His filmography is hard to track down. Most of what is available is in the public domain. These John Ford, Will Rogers movies with Step and Fetch It, which are really kind of like blurry and hokey and will not turn anybody on to Will Rogers. But there's a movie he made called Mr. Skiffle with Zazu Pitts and a woman named Florence Desmond. And Florence Desmond was an impersonator. She did impressions in the early 30s. And this movie, I recommend to people if they can find it anywhere. I think it's only available as a bootleg, but it's like a W.C. Fields movie, except starring Will Rogers, like wacky, zany, Man on the Flying Trapeze, International House, or Diplomaniacs.
Right, yeah. Joe
Mankiewicz movie with Wheeler and Woolsey. It's got that wacky zaniness. Zazu Pitts and Will Rogers play a husband and wife. They go on a family vacation. They got two annoying kids in the back seat that will not stop, just won't shut up. And Will Rogers is getting testier and testier, very much like Fields. They end up in Yellowstone National Park at the Geyser, and their car breaks down and they bump into Florence Desmond. And Florence Desmond was famous at the time for doing an impression of Zazu Pitts. And so Zazu Pitts comes out and says, can you help us with our car? And Florence Desmond starts doing Zazu Pitts to Zazu Pitts. It's weird, like, oh dear, oh my, do you have a flat tire? Oh yes, oh dear.
Famous Pits on Pits.
Famous Pits on Pits. I'm alienating your entire listening audience with these Zazu Pitts references, but Mr. Skiffle.
There was a Zazu Pitts Memorial Orchestra. Was
for real?
Something. Yeah, it was a band in Boston. I have to look it up.
Sounds like a Rhino Records.
There was something, or a sketch group. There was some kind of Zazu Pitts Memorial Orchestra. I'll have to look that up. But I want to move up to a more modern time. Talk about Charlie Hill, because Charlie Hill was the most famous indigenous modern stand-up.
Yes,
I think.
far.
I remember Charlie from the Comedy Store and seeing him on a late night television. Famous for his opening, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
So where did he talk a little bit about Charlie Hill? Because he's probably by and large, the only Native American comedian that many people listening to this have probably even seen.
Yes, because he appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show in '78, back in the days when a successful spot on Johnny Carson was really a huge deal. And it did position him well for the burgeoning comedy boom. From that, he just worked for years without having to worry about it.
Yeah. No, I know I might have met him, but I know people that knew him well.
Yeah. I mean, he was always around the Comedy Store for like 30 years. He was just a fixture. He was sort of like an Argus Hamilton type.
And a famous and a good guy. I mean, I just remember people going, Charlie Hill was there. And like, he was a good guy. He wasn't like a weirdo.
No, he was very beloved. I've heard stories that, unlike most of us in comedy, he had no snobbery. So if somebody was an amateur comic, he would talk to them.
He would welcome. It was very welcoming, and that's great.
Yeah, whereas most of us want nothing to do with the new person. Get away from me. I don't know if you're funny. I don't want to be stuck talking to you.
We are all reptiles. We are all reptiles.
Yeah. So Charlie was the opposite. This welcoming, loving guy, and if you were funny, he loved you even more. And just a generous laughter. People talk about how Jeff Altman would tell me how he'd be bombing on stage at the Comedy Store, but he could hear Charlie laughing in the back. And it was one of those things, you end up just doing your act for Charlie because you know he's into you bombing, and these other people don't care.
Don't matter, and they don't matter.
Yeah. So that would keep you going. You liked hanging out with Charlie Hill in the back hallway. He was one of those comics that you're glad that he was there.
Right. Yeah.
All the time. But Charlie got his start, he was a Oneida from Wisconsin, and grew up in Detroit, and then moved back to the reservation where his family was originally from. His father brought them back there, him and his siblings. And he was just one of these kids of the 50s obsessed with TV. Soupy Sales was the biggest thing going in Detroit. So Charlie Hill was just like all about Soupy Sales. Then on Saturday nights, the Jackie Gleason show, he would say Professor Irwin Corey on Jackie Gleason. And so when he got a little bit older, when Charlie was about 15 or 16, he got a fake ID and found out that the Professor Irwin Corey was going to be performing live at a nightclub in Minneapolis. Used the fake ID, went and saw Professor Irwin Corey, his first live stand-up experience, loved it, hid out in the bathroom during the changeover so that he could stay and watch the Late Show and see Irwin Corey a second time. So he was like a lot of us as a young guy, just obsessed.
And was heartbroken to see that it was exactly the same show.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
probably,
of course.
Or fascinated, when that first moment when you realize as a young comedy fan that this person on stage is saying the same thing every night. It is sort of like a eureka moment when you realize,
or when you see a band in one city and then you follow them to the next city and it's like, hey, wait a minute.
Wait, you said
the same pattern.
Yeah. This is the best audience we've ever played. Yeah. Wait a second.
I remember hearing John Entwistle tell the same intro 2 nights in a row, which was for Boris the Spider. It was no, it wasn't for Boris the Spider. It was for my wife. Because I wish I had £1 million for every time I introduced this. Oh, I have. I heard 2 nights in a row.
Oh my God! But anyways, Charlie Hill, young comedy fan, wanted to do stand-up, did not really see a path as a Native American kid, had never seen an indigenous person on TV before himself.
What path did they see into anything? I'm not saying that in a horrific way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're beaten down, when you're marginalized, when you're
a testament to his fortitude.
But he came of a generation as well in which the late 60s, when activism became on the forefront. So the American Indian movement started to make headlines. Partially
when the most famous Indian fighter was Irish Tom Laughlin.
Yeah, sure. Billy Jack, I mean, there's a little mini genre of native vengeance films in the Billy Jack tradition from that era. There's a terrible movie called Johnny Thundercloud. It's the same thing. It's like for people who found Billy Jack too highbrow, you can rent.
And I'm assuming that Tom Laughlin was not native at all.
I don't really know.
I have to. Larry would know, but I'm gonna find this out for myself.
Yeah, I mean, those are camp classics. Even among native peoples, people love the Billy Jack movies just because they're so ridiculous.
Yeah.
They're so preposterous. They're so pretentious. I mean, one of them is 3 hours long.
Yeah, Trial of Billy Jack is 3 hours.
3 hours of Billy Jack.
So many shots of an eagle.
I'm just remiss there was never a Walking Tall Billy Jack crossover movie. There should have been. That would have been, Buford Pusser, whatever his name is.
Buford Pusser, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's called Walking Jack, and it had a strange connotation.
One guy with his feet. And
you can't do it. You can't do it.
But Charlie Hill was of that generation when that activist movement was happening. So he was, again, well positioned. He was informed and influenced by the politics that were swirling around him at the time. He attended something called the Clyde Warrior Institute, which was sort of inspired by the civil rights movement. They kind of trained different indigenous activists to take direct action, nonviolent protest methods to get things done, the same way as the lunch counter sit-ins. So there was something called the fish-ins in the mid-'60s that were much like the sit-ins,
right?
The civil rights movement. And the fish-ins were in Washington, treaties that had granted certain Native nations the right to fish wherever they wanted, as much as they wanted, were being suppressed by the state government. The state of Washington said, no, you can only fish on the reservation. So the state was breaking the treaty. And so these fish-ins were staged, these protests where people would fish in defiance. And there was a bunch of different Native nations that also got attention from people like Buffy St. Marie and Marlon Brando and Dick Gregory, who came there in solidarity. So Charlie Hill was inspired by that universe. And his plan was to enter comedy however he could and to bring that type of point of view into stand-up. So when he came to the Comedy Store for the first time at the end of 1974, we had just gone through this period in America where Native American issues were on the news, the siege at Wounded Knee, Leonard Peltier, all these things were
Alcatraz.
All of that. So that is the ethos that sort of inspired Charlie Hill. That is the fabric from which he is cut to a certain degree.
Okay.
And so, at that point, the Ed Sullivan Show is just winding up. Charlie Hill was watching Ed Sullivan. He was inspired by Dick Gregory. He was inspired by Bob Newhart.
Yeah, I was going to say, because he is like Richard Pryor at that time, that he's really funny, but he also has a point of view and a cultural awareness and a socio-political awareness.
Yeah, exactly.
But he's also disguising it in comedy,
Yeah, well, he started with doing old street jokes. He would cut out, there was a thing in Parade magazine, the newspaper supplement, called My Favorite Jokes. You remember that in the late 60s and early 70s, this thing, My Favorite Jokes, would have a picture of a comedian and then a list of street jokes that really had nothing to do with the comedian. But they would have a different comedian every week saying, my favorite jokes. But it was always like, did you hear the one about the doctor? And Charlie Hill used to clip those. And he started his original act just doing My Favorite Jokes, street jokes. He actually read them on the radio. He had a campus radio show because he had heard that Bob Newhart had become a stand-up comedian by starting in radio. So he tried to do that because he was in Wisconsin, and before the comedy boom, it was like where
there was no clubs in Wisconsin where you could perform.
Yeah, exactly. So he was doing radio. He eventually got accepted into a native theater collective, the first of its kind in Greenwich Village, called the Native American Theater Ensemble. It was an experimental, bizarre theater company, and he starred in 2 plays, and that was his first introduction to performing. And they went on a tour of Europe, and it was supposed to be this sort of empowering
thing. Late 60s, early 70s in New York?
Yeah, 71,
Yeah.
72.
Yeah,
they did an experimental play about Alcatraz. It was called Foghorn, and you heard the bleeding of the Alcatraz foghorn over the audio throughout the thing. And these weren't comedies; they were very serious, but they were very interesting and sort of out there.
Right.
And really, not to bring it back to Billy Jack, but it reminds me of those experimental theater sequences in some of the Billy Jack movies.
I know
where the hippies are sitting around cross-legged watching.
And the committee is in one of those movies.
Yeah, Howard Hessman shows up in a tie-dyed shirt in a Billy Jack movie. Yeah. I think Fred Willard might be in one of them as well. Absolutely. As the Ace Trucking Co.
Yeah, Howard Hessman's also in a dragnet arguing against having police. The defund the police argument was even in 1967 or 68. And he's, we don't need the police, man. Well, that's what you say now, son. But
yeah, little people know defund the police was coined by Blue Boy. He's the guy who coined that phrase. But
I know a guy that's in that episode too. Lou Wagner is in that episode.
Really?
Who was in an improv troupe with Fred Willard.
Well, there you go. Yeah, there's a TV show completely forgotten called Hey Landlord. It was created by Gary Marshall. It starred Sandy Barron, the obscure stand-up comedian.
Sure, Sandy Barron.
And that entire show seems to be staffed by incidental people from the committee and that universe. Carl Gottlieb, Larry Hankin, Fred Willard, all these dudes that were sort of like the new pot-smoking comedians who
the
really
West Coast
were
Nat
not
Lamp.
famous, but what's that?
It was the West Coast Nat Lamp.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, that's a good analogy for sure. Yeah.
National Lampoon.
And Gomer Pyle, the famous Gomer Pyle, where Rob Reiner plays a hippie and they sing Blowing in the Wind, which everybody knows. All three of the hippies are from the committee. It's, oh God, I'm forgetting all of their names. The woman who played the pot-smoking hippie in the Smothers Brothers, Lee French, is that her name?
Yeah, I don't know.
I think that's her name. She's the other hippie with Rob Reiner. And this guy, Christopher Ross, I think is his name, who was friends of Carl Gottlieb. They were in a show called Music Scene, which was like a hipster American bandstand that Tommy Smothers produced in the late, I think, 1969. It was hosted by David Steinberg with the committee.
Right, okay. That all tracks. That's all the same group.
Yeah, and it's like Janis Joplin. It's weird because it'll be like the committee and they'll introduce Janis Joplin, but then the next song is like by... trying to think of somebody real like Andy Williams.
Right.
Like that,
Whatever they could get. Let's move ahead to current indigenous comedy. As you were talking about the 1491s, and there's a great bumper crop of new young comedians that are indigenous that, it seems like the roadblocks are really down and that, one of the beautiful things about the internet is that the traditional gatekeepers of show business have been mitigated. And if you're a great comic and you've got some good clips and you can get them on YouTube, and if they get traction, they get traction. And you don't have to please Fred de Cordova. And that these people are rising to the top and getting a lot of notoriety. Who are some of the indigenous comics that you think are really worth watching and seeing?
Yeah, well, there's lots. I mean, the 1491s are among the most popular with Native audiences these days. They did essentially start on YouTube. You can still go to their YouTube channel. There's tons of videos, the 1491s, 1491S, no apostrophe. And the videos, some of them are just super, super clever. If you're somebody like Dana Gould, who's been in comedy a while, you can tell within a few seconds of watching somebody
knows what they're doing.
Yeah, you're like, oh, this person has it.
Yeah.
They've got it. The 1491s are like that. As soon as you watch it, you're like, oh, they've got it. They have that inherent comic ability that some people are blessed to have. And they're fucking hilarious. And I went and saw them do this show, like I said, at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and it was hilarious. It was this brilliant.
Are they from up there?
No, they're from all over the country. They're from 5 different places, actually. 2 of them are from Oklahoma. And they're from all around. But they did this show at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival that was so funny. The analogy that I've been using, and I think even they used at one point, it's very much like Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1, in which it tells stories from history that are like the bleakest, least comic subject matter. So in their case, it's a telling of the story of Native America. It's called Between Two Knees, starting in 1890 with the Wounded Knee Massacre. Yeah. And then 1973, the standoff at Wounded Knee between two.
Right.
And, they talk about residential schools and genocide and child rape, these horrific subjects. But the whole thing is structured like a Naked Gun or Airplane style movie.
Wow.
With just joke. The whole thing is jokes.
God, I got to see that.
Visual jokes and verbal jokes. And it was hilarious. It killed. It destroyed. I was there for opening night. And I think they did some rewrites, but it played for like another 6 months. And then the coronavirus shutdown happened. So now it's on pause. But they were going to tour with it. And I hope anybody
Between
listening,
Two Knees, the 1491s.
Yeah, it is just a tremendous show. Super, super funny. I talk about it in the book, but to see it live is better than their videos, better than me writing about it. It's just tremendous, funny stuff. And they are among my favorites, the 1491s. And
yeah, I'm going to check them out.
Individually, all 5 of them are great artists. Sterling Harjo has a new TV show coming out. He's one of the 1491s. He and Taika Waititi, who made Jojo Rabbit, they've got a new TV show coming out on FX called Reservation Dogs, which looks really good.
Right, I've heard about it, actually.
Yeah. So they're really among my favorites. Also, I talk about a woman named Adrienne Chalpa in the book, a woman named Dakota Ray Hebert. There's a lot of young, talented people, but a lot of it is, like you said, because of the internet, a lot of Indigenous people who normally would be very far apart from each other are able to sort of collude and collaborate. And it sort of helped sort of fuse a larger comedy community.
Oh, great. Well, the book is called We Had a Little Real Estate Problem. It's by Kliph Nesteroff, and it's a history of Native American comedy, Indigenous peoples stand-up comedy in North America. But you get a lot more out of it too. It's very entertaining.
I think anybody who reads who enjoyed my first book will enjoy this same book. I think if you're political, you'll like this book. If you're apolitical, you'll like this book.
Yeah.
The only people that won't like it are the raving racists.
Yeah.
So buy this book. Otherwise,
and don't be one of those people.
Right.
Kliph Nesteroff.
They're true tales from Weirdsville. Tales from Weirdsville. And they're true.
Can your heart stand the shocking facts?
The year was 1958, and it is the height of what we think of as the 50s here in America. Elvis Presley, the Big Bopper, hula hoops, Ike, the whole bit. And in Gary, Indiana, a child is born. The 8th of 10 children born to Joe and Kathy Jackson. All of them piled into a 2-bedroom house on, of all places, Jackson Street. The Jacksons were not swimming in cash. Joe was a former boxer and a crane operator for U.S. Steel. Kathy had a part-time gig at Sears. They both had musical aspirations. Joe played rhythm guitar in a local R&B band, and Kathy wanted to be a country and western performer. But with 10 kids on a crane operator's salary, as they say, good luck with that. But the Jacksons were undeterred. In 1964, Joe formed a band, only he wasn't in it. The Jackson Brothers, which was composed of his children, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and young Michael. It's not known if Joe knew the Beach Boys' father, Murray Wilson, but they seem to have shared the same management style.
Brian, I'm a genius too. Let's go, huh?
Oh, and that was just the start of it. By all accounts, Joe Jackson was a monster. No, I mean Joe Jackson, father of the Jacksons, not Joe Jackson who sang Look Sharp and Steppin' Out in the early 80s. He was a white dude from England. But this is Joe Jackson, father of the Jacksons, an emotionally and physically abusive dick. The Jackson kids, abuse was all they knew, so they endured it. And as the old saying goes, what could go wrong? The Jackson children were all talented, Michael extraordinarily so. Although only 6 years old, Michael Jackson began splitting the lead vocals with his older brother Jermaine, and the group changed its name to the Jackson 5. They covered songs like Robert Parker's Barefootin' and The Temptations' My Girl. In 1965, the group won a talent show and began performing in clubs in the Midwest as an opening act for groups like Sam and Dave, the OJs, Gladys Knight, and Etta James. Now, these clubs made up what was known then as the Chitlin Circuit. In 1968, the Jackson 5 opened for an act called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. Bobby Taylor brought them to Motown Records. They signed, and Joe Jackson moved his family to Los Angeles. In January of 1970, I Want You Back by the Jackson 5 went to number 1 on Billboard's Hot 100. And the hits kept coming. ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There. Michael grew from a child star to a teen idol, releasing 4 solo albums on Motown between 72 and 75. He moved to New York in 1978 to play the Scarecrow in the musical movie The Wiz. Now, this move allowed him to further his independence from the Jackson 5, now called the Jacksons, and it exposed him to early hip-hop, which was just beginning to surface in the New York underground. He also broke his nose during a dance number, which supposedly caused breathing issues that affected his singing and sent him down the long road of many, many surgeries to his nose. Now, the music for The Wiz was produced by Quincy Jones, who would produce Jackson's 5th solo album in 1979, Off the Wall. Off the Wall produced 4 top 10 singles: Off the Wall, She's Out of My Life, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Rock With You. The album reached number 3 on the Billboard charts and sold over 20 million copies worldwide. In late 1982, Jackson reunited with Quincy Jones to release the album Thriller, which would go on to become the best-selling album in the world. A mind-boggling 66 million copies were sold. It won 8 Grammys, and by the end of 1983, Thriller had made Michael Jackson, quite simply, the biggest star on Earth. But it wasn't enough. Like Elvis Presley before him, he needed a chimp. In 1983, as his global superstardom was on its ascent, Michael Jackson purchased Bubbles, a chimpanzee. Bubbles was born at a facility in Austin, Texas that bred primates for animal testing. So we can all be thankful that he got out of there, although when you know the whole story, one wonders, out of the frying pan? Bubbles initially lived at the Jackson family home in Encino. Why not? And between the years 83 and 88, 2 things occurred. Michael Jackson's position as a global superstar was cemented, and his reputation as a global superstar who was batshit crazy was also cemented. Now, for one thing, starting in the mid-1980s, Jackson's skin started to grow more and more pale. The story was that he suffered from vitiligo, a condition where patches of your skin lose its pigment, as well as a thing called discoid lupus erythematosus, which I've probably mispronounced, which is another skin condition. It's the thing that Seal has. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Add to that 2 more nose jobs and a chin implant, dramatic weight loss. In 1986, tabloids released pictures of Jackson sleeping in a glass coffin, and that started the story that he slept in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber to slow his aging. Then the stories that he took female hormone shots to keep his voice high, that he had a shrine to Elizabeth Taylor. Who doesn't? He offered to buy the skeleton of John Merrick, the Elephant Man. The British press gave Michael a new nickname that stuck: Wacko Jacko. But the juggernaut of his fame continued. In 1987, Jackson released the follow-up to Thriller, Bad, which boasted 5 hit singles. In '88, he released his autobiography, Moonwalking, which went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. That same year, he purchased a 2,700-acre patch of land near Santa Ynez, California, and built a new home for himself, the Neverland Ranch, at a cost of about $17 million, which today would be about $40 million. Neverland had its own Ferris wheel, a carousel, a movie theater, and a private zoo. A security staff of 40 people patrolled the grounds at Neverland Ranch. And like any normal human being who lives in a private amusement park, he moved in with his chimp. Now, despite the fact that Neverland had a private zoo, Bubbles slept in a crib beside Michael's bed. He went to the movies with Michael at Neverland's private movie theater. He ate dinner at the dining table. He wore a diaper, but also, reportedly, used Jackson's toilet. So why the diaper? According to Robert Thompson, a professor of popular culture at Syracuse University, Bubbles was when, quote, the weirdness took on mythic proportions, end quote. The late 1980s were a busy time if you were Bubbles the chimp. Michael Jackson was traveling all over the world, and Bubbles was always at his side. Bubbles purportedly had his own agent and his own bodyguard. Jackson also had a pet snake, and he insisted that both the snake and Bubbles attend the recording sessions for Bad. Bubbles and Jackson shared a 2-bedroom suite in Tokyo and had tea with the mayor at City Hall. Not everybody liked Bubbles. Freddie Mercury didn't. Freddie Mercury and Michael Jackson were attempting to record a duet called There Must Be More to Life Than This. But Jackson insisted that Bubbles sit with them on the playbacks and would ask Bubbles at the end of a track, do you think we should do that again? After several nights of this, Mercury exploded, I'm not performing with a fucking chimp sitting next to me each night, and left the project. But Bubbles, like all biological organisms, got older and bigger. And chimps, as they get older and bigger, become extremely less cuddly. When Jackson's son Prince Michael was born, there was a legitimate fear that Bubbles, older, stronger, and more aggressive, could potentially harm the child. This was actually a smart realization. Bubbles was then relocated to animal trainer Bob Dunn's ranch in nearby Sylmar, California. In 1993, Michael, for the first but not the last time, was accused of child molestation. His reign as the globally beloved King of Pop was now shadowed by the incredibly disturbing reports of his behavior and, it has to be said, for legal reasons, alleged criminal activity. It was reported that in 2003, when Bubbles heard the news, he tried to commit suicide. Now, it is true that chimpanzees, under duress, will self-harm. But whether the source of this behavior in Bubbles is attributable to a news story, or just the fact that he was now living apart from the only world he ever knew, will never be known. Michael Jackson died of a cardiac arrest in 2009 at the age of 50. Animal trainer Bob Dunn said Bubbles and Michael were close friends and playmates. The last time Michael visited, Bubbles definitely recognized and remembered him. He said that Jackson thought of Bubbles as his first child, and added that he hoped Jackson's children would keep in touch with their stepbrother following their father's death. As to whether or not that really happened, Bubbles ain't talking.
And now, on with the show.
The 1491s are composed of Sterling Harjo, Thomas Ryan Redcorn, Migazee Pinchot, Dallas Goldtooth, and my next guest, Bobby Wilson. Welcome to the podcast, Bobby.
That's me. Happy to be here.
So, for those of us who are uninitiated, what is you're a five-guy comedy troupe, but how long of the 1491? Now, 1491 for obvious because of the year before Columbus arrived and made everything better.
Yeah. Starbucks and syphilis to the people.
Billboards. when did the 1491s come together as a group? This is obviously in reference to Kliph. I knew about you guys through Kliph Nesteroff's book. I was not aware.
I like how you brushed past the word discovered.
Yeah,
good choice.
you became known to me. Yeah, see, it's all in language. In Kliph's book, and but I knew Charlie. Like that was I remember watching Charlie on that first Tonight Show I saw as a kid, because I was a comedy nerd. So when did the 1491s form? Because you all come from very disparate backgrounds.
We do. We came together 11 years ago now to make our first video on YouTube.
Right. And your YouTube channel is just 1491s?
Correct.
Really funny stuff. Really, really funny for those of you who are. Yeah.
Thanks. We had a good time.
Yeah. No, it's doing sketch comedy, as you know, is it's its own discipline. In addition to you have to find you have to find your style, and you're integrating different styles. Like, Sterling's writing style might not be the same as yours or Dallas's, and like in the Kids in the Hall, like you can tell who. Is it a Dave sketch? Is it a Scott sketch? You can tell. And I imagine that you guys have that same sort of dynamic.
I think we do. Personally, for me, I love Sterling's ideas the best because he hates making these YouTube videos. He really hates performing, hates getting up in front of people.
So he's perfect to be in a sketch group.
Yeah, perfect to be in a sketch group. And I found that when he does decide to actually do something and that he's excited about, it tends to be something really mind-blowing for all of us.
Right.
To kind of throw all of our resources into. And by all of our resources, I mean like, $10 here, $20 there.
Sure.
Stupid props.
Yeah, no, but it's great. And I also think that, and this is really, it's obvious in any sketch group, that the production limitations help.
They
really do. They really, really do. The best example is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, following behind them in coconuts. And it was just because they couldn't afford horses.
Who can afford horses? Who the hell can afford horses?
Especially when you're filming in the Scotland Hebrides. But they couldn't afford horses, so they came up with that idea. It's brilliant, and it just makes the movie so much. So it just adds to the wedding cake of layers of that movie.
Really beautiful.
Perfectly. And the limits actually help the comedy, and I think the same is true. I mean, same as Mr. Show and Python and your guys as well.
Yeah.
Do you where did you first start performing? And because it was interesting, there's a thing in the book that I wanted to. It was. I want to get. I don't want to misquote. This is from the book. This is a quote of Sterling. White people are easy to make fun of, and if you make fun of white people in front of Indians, you're sort of yelling into a vacuum.
Yeah.
I agree. That's not what I would have assumed. By yelling into a vacuum, does that mean that everyone agree? It's a given anyway, and they're not going to laugh, or it's too easy of a laugh.
We talk in our group a lot about low-hanging fruit, especially when it comes to what we all call like Indian humor between us. It's so easy to say, you can get most Indians to agree that white people did some fucked up stuff. You can get most white people to agree to that.
Sure. Let's just start with genocide. Let's throw that one out.
Yeah, there's a good starting.
Let's start right there. Sure.
It's a lot tougher to get Indians to agree. Well, I shouldn't say it's tougher because we've had some great success in that, but getting Indians to agree that we're also fucked up is kind of the challenging part of it, because it's really, I think with a lot of comedy, it's really easy to just kind of cross a line and go too far where you alienate people.
Sure.
And it can be a lot harder to sort of be smart about it so that people maybe at first don't realize that you're making fun of them until about 5 minutes later when they're, and I only say it out of personal experience where it's definitely happened to me before where I've been like, oh shit, I kind of am like that. And
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's the universality of that, and there's also the fact that, and you see this in with black humor, like with the very early Pryor in the '60s. This is for us. They're not supposed to know this. Mm-hmm. This is for us. It sort of inadvertently reinforces the concept that it's a monolith. That community is a monolith. That there's no individuation within the community, which is obviously not true. And so, so that's an interesting thing to go beyond. And when you started to do that, did you get pushback from audiences, or is the laugh huge, or is the laugh bigger?
It's I actually think that you kind of get the polar opposites when it comes to that type of humor, because some people are like, oh shit, like that's my uncle you're talking about, and like it makes it so personal and hilarious. But then for the opposite, we've been booed, we've been hissed, we've had people throw shit at us, we've had people try to fight us at shows.
Really, yeah.
Somebody called the cops on us once in Oklahoma, which was ridiculous.
An audience member called the police on you because of your content?
Yeah, because we were cussing in front of their kids. That was their reasoning behind it.
Was this an indigenous person, or was this a white person?
White person. Actually, it was probably the worst time to perform. We were out on what's called Guthrie Green in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the Cherokee Nation, they're really big on organizing these different events, and they had like a musical event, and they asked us to perform. So Sterling, myself, and Migazi Pensinawal came out, and they had a sandwich between like a semi-popular underground reggae group and like. Oh,
by the way, just so you know, all reggae groups are underground.
That's a good point. And they had like 3 fans that were just sitting in, like they had their chairs parked waiting for us to like get done with our little show, so that they're, they had the t-shirts on and everything. That's so funny. But the day before, Trump had been there to campaign because he hadn't quite been elected yet. And man, those people were so hyped up from that. They were just energized, and their governor
in a bad way or a good way.
Well, I mean, it seemed good for them.
Yeah, they're strongly
Yeah. There's just a whole ton of red hats in the back row, and so we started kind of. I mean, it was easy enough to open up by making fun of the governor and her friendship with the soon-to-be president at the time, and the crowd didn't take too lightly to it, and they all went from the very back to the very front really quickly.
Sure. Dude, I had a guy, I was in fucking Portland, Oregon, liberal Nirvana, Portland, Oregon. I had a guy throw a beer at me for a mild observation, but... And it's unique to him. It's unique to him. I mean, I've been doing comedy long enough. I had bits about Reagan when he was the president. I had bits. I was a comedian I started doing stand up right out of high school. Reagan was president. Then Clinton, and people never threw beers, but no president ever rode the victimization culture as strongly as he did, and that's I to indigenous peoples it must be so galling because and I roll my eyes at it, but it's when you look at grievance culture, it's like if you listen to Ben Shapiro or Joe Rogan or any of those guys, it's like, who are the most oppressed people in this country? Easy, white men. Automatically, it's just, and it is, it's like, where do you start?
It must be systemically. I mean, if white men are the most oppressed people in the country, then it is definitely white on white crime.
It's just,
I need to quit.
I know. It's like, but it is true, and you do get that feeling of like, where do I start?
And they believe it. My brothers believe it.
Yeah.
But as someone said, when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
That's right. Yeah. Spoken like a true influencer.
And I think that I'm a big influencer. When you started touring, where's the place that you thought like, oh my God, this is going to fucking suck? And it was great.
Oh, what's going to suck? Well,
or you thought it was going to suck and it was great.
We never really had an idea that we were going to tour. Really, it was just we had fun making YouTube videos.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's the smart way to do it. It's like, oh, I can be at home and reach people.
Yeah. Well, it was funny because I don't know if you know this, but Indians travel like fucking crazy. Regardless of how little money you have, like we used to just pile in our buddy's car and just like go to Oklahoma with little to no money.
Right.
And this is how we continued to make 1491's videos. I think Ryan Redcorn and Sterling Harjo were the only people that actually had stable employment,
right?
Who could afford to go anywhere. But those of us from Minnesota, Dallas, Migazy, and myself would just kind of just like I said, hop in a car and just start driving somewhere. But
go over to Scotty.
Yeah, man, we would just cruise down the 35, go all the way south.
And where in Minnesota are you? Where in Minnesota did you grow up?
I grew up in the Twin Cities, kind of all around different.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we ever lived anywhere more than 2 years.
I had a similar. I used to go back to the Comedy Gallery.
Where is that?
Minneapolis.
Well, it ain't anymore then.
No. Now it's Acme.
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah. But I used to go to Minneapolis every year. Like when the world was open, I went to Minneapolis once or twice a year.
It's a beautiful place, and there's a lot of funding for the art.
Great place, yeah.
I had a great time, even though we grew up kind of fucked up. When I decided that I was going to be an artist at a very early age, there was a lot of support for it. And for as many people.
Now, why do you say that? We grew up kind of fucked up. Why do you say that?
Oh, well, I mean, like my family, it's funny to think about. I've been talking to my therapist about it a lot. I finally started therapy because I'm a TV writer now and I can afford to do stuff. So,
well, I'll be sending you a bill for $150 at the end of this too. So it works out.
Yeah, you know what? I'll overpay you. Don't worry about it. Keep the change, bud. No, we my family, we lived in a van for a while. We lived in a motel for about a year or so. I remember my whole kindergarten age. We lived in just a single, me, my mom, my dad, and my sister, and a dog, all just lived in a hotel room. And it's crazy. I have pictures of it. I was just like, how the fuck did we live? And having my own child now, I'm like, Jesus Christ! How did you live like that? It's crazy. But then I ran away from home and went to Worcester.
Well, okay, 10 minutes from where I grew up.
Is that it?
Yeah, 10 minutes. I grew up in Milford, Massachusetts, which is literally 10 minutes. If you're talking about Worcester, Massachusetts, Worcester. I grew up literally 15 minutes from Worcester.
Oh, fucking A.
Yeah.
Well, I was in Worcester for just a few months before I got
2 months too long
enrolled. Yeah. Hey,
how old were you? No.
I was 14 years old. I just hopped on a Greyhound.
All right, let's unpack this. We have to go back now. I have to unpack this. What did your dad do?
He was a shady medicine man who would charge rich white people to have ceremonies.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what he did for a living.
Right.
And
shady.
my mom cleaned their house.
See, shady. When you say shady medicine man, that could also mean something else. So I just want to clarify that you're speaking literally.
Yeah. Okay. He was a shaman. That literally just means
Okay.
Shady medicine man.
No, shady medicine man could mean drug dealer.
Right. Yeah.
No, he was literally a shady medicine man. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. And did he? My childhood was also. We're both in comedy. Nobody ever said well, now that I have my emotional shit together, I'm gonna go beg strangers to love me. We come from similar. Did you know at the time that was fucked up that you're living in a motel, or to you it was just like, This is it. This is what everybody does. Yeah.
It was just life, you know.
Right.
I didn't know that we were homeless. Like we had a bed.
Right.
You know? I wasn't hungry. We were at McDonald's all the time.
Right. Sure. And was your dad cool with it? Or was he enraged? Like you and I as parents would not tolerate it.
No, fuck no. Oh my God. Are you kidding me? I'd be selling my plasma. I'd be doing all sorts of shit.
And that's why
I definitely wouldn't be a happy person.
Right. And was your dad, what was his attitude about it?
You know, it's really hard to say. And I do think about it sometimes because he was a pretty rageful dude, not a happy camper just in life in general, unless we were out. I mean, he seemed to enjoy living out of a tent. That seemed to really fill him full of happiness.
Is he still with us? Is he?
No. Thankfully, he passed away about 12 years ago.
Okay, well, that says a lot.
Yeah, he's in a better place, the Veterans Cemetery in Rapid City, Oklahoma, or South Dakota.
Right, and is your mom around, or?
No, she's not. Okay. She passed away as well about 5 years ago now.
Okay.
Oh no! That was a while back too. Now.
And at 14, you said, like, I'm out.
Yeah. Well, I had found out, we left my dad, kind of escaped him in the middle of the night when I was about 12 years old.
Was he a violent guy, or?
Yeah, big time. And he had confessed to me that an owl had visited him at the night and told him that my mom was about to die and that he needed to help her transition to the spirit world. And so we were going to stay with my aunt and uncle.
Common.
Yeah, this happens all the time. It's everybody wishes they could go this way.
I remember an owl came to us and told us that they were going to cancel The Nanny, and we were really upset because we were big fans of the show.
I hope you're prepared. You know, the owl is a messenger, not just of death, but of major changes. So
an owl visited us and told us that the Sopranos finale was disappointing.
So did you skip it, or did you just power through it?
We powered through it anyway. So and you're 14 years old and you're getting this. I don't mean to make light of it, but
no,
12,
totally.
Okay.
I mean, it's that's why I'm in therapy, bro.
Sure.
But no, he told me
you're preaching to the choir.
At 12, I knew. I mean, I could read between the lines, and I told my uncle about it.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those where you go,
Yeah, I'm like,
I'm going to back out of the room.
It was so crazy that he thought that, I don't know.
Well, there's a level of
on his mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. Well, there's many things going on, but there was a documentary that I saw about this guy that was a doctor, and I forget the name of it. And he had a bunch of kids, and he loved to surf, and they would just live in a van or a bus, and they would drive around, and he would make them surf, and they were homeschooled because he just wanted to surf all the time. And if they had money, he would spend it all, so they would have no money, and then they would get and then he would go work. He was a doctor, and then he would go work at a clinic and make a little bit of money. But he forced the kids to have no route. They just traveled around and surfed. And of course, all the kids grew up full of anger because this is just narcissism.
Yeah.
This is what I want to do at the expense of the people who are relying on me to do just the opposite of this.
Yeah.
The biological imperative of my children is to have stability, safety, routine.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
and you're putting your whatever bullshit in before that. It's just pure narcissism.
Yeah.
And then you add to that whatever mental, emotional issues cause you to be violent, cause you to believe an owl tells you that, if in fact you do believe it. And
I never knew if he believed what he was saying, but
sure.
To this day, I still wonder, did he just think that I would believe that? Or that other people believed him? I mean, as a shaman, people did believe him about pretty much anything that he said. And, hearing that, I mean, that was fucking nuts. So we took off. We left Superior, Wisconsin, where my aunt and uncle lived. My uncle stood guard outside of where my dad was sleeping, stood guard with a fucking rifle, and didn't let him leave for like a day, so that we could escape.
Get some ground.
Yeah. So, and he gave me my dad's handgun too, which is we do not have. I do not possess now.
But it's something you don't want him to have for sure.
Right. It's fucking humongous too. But so we left. We went to battered women's shelters, and we got on the list for Section 8 housing, which took about 2 years to get. So yeah, I know. So we bounced around shelters and lived on people's couches and stuff like that.
Yeah, and also in Minnesota.
Yeah, in Minnesota,
where 9 months of the year you can't just be outside.
Right.
It's like people forget. Like downtown Minnesota, they have tunnels between the buildings.
Yeah,
so you don't have to go outside during the winter. Yeah,
I used to have, man, when I was a little shit, I used to skateboard in those skyways with my friends, and we would just tag on shit. But this is before.
That's hilarious.
It was so I just can't believe some of the shit we got away with in those skyways. Yeah. But
the Replacements have a song called Skyway.
Do they?
You remember the Replacements? Probably don't.
No, I'm still quite young, I think.
They were a rock and roll band.
Hold on, I'm going to have to go
80s and 90s. Minneapolis-based rock and roll band on the Minneapolis label Twin Tone.
Oh, the Replacements. I see. Okay.
Yes. They would play your Fifth Street entry more than your 7th Avenue.
7th Street entry, First Avenue.
Yes. What did I say? 5th and 1st?
So it was like 5th and 7th. You were close. You were close.
Minneapolis and its sister city, St. Christopher.
Good old St. Christopher's. They used to call him Pig's Eye before that. I don't know. You're a little young to remember that, Dana.
So, and then, so you're with your mom for 2 years, and then does your dad never, was that the end of it?
No, that wasn't the end of it. He sent a guy to like kidnap me at a powwow one time. I punched this dude in the balls and ran like 3 miles to my best friend's apartment. And then he was taking us to court over custody stuff. And his argument was that our mom wasn't actually our biological mom. And I was like, fucking who gives a shit? Like,
so what?
Let him fucking, he's crazy. Like,
yeah.
And then she fucking admitted to me that she was not my biological mom. That my dad had multiple wives in periods of time in his life, and that my biological mom was a woman that used to live with them in the 80s.
Okay.
And she was mine and my sister's biological mom. But she took off almost immediately after my younger sister was born. And so I have no memory of her, nor is my sister. And that threw, I was 14 years old when I'm told.
That's awful. Yeah.
Like, what the fuck do I do with this?
Yeah. You are powered by a nuclear rod of rage.
Yeah. So,
but by the way, to which you have no choice, because that's the biological imperative. That is the genetic biological imperative of a mammal, and so you don't have that. So there's no way you can emotionally develop unscarred by that. There's no way.
No, I was the embodiment of punching a hole in grandma's wall.
Right. Sure.
So there was a lady who married a guy from Gloucester.
Gloucester.
Yeah, he had the crazy accent too, man. And they lived in Minnesota for a period of time.
That must have been a weird combination of accents. Hey, what's going on over here? Oh, I don't know.
Let's go get the scooter, huh? Do you like scooters? Let's go do that. Yeah, no, that was crazy. But she was our family's legal advocate in court when I was a kid, and they had moved to Massachusetts. And I reached out to her when I found out this information, and she was like, don't do anything destructive to yourself or to your family. Like, I'm going to get you a Greyhound ticket, and you can come out here and stay with us for a period of time until you figure your stuff out, and we'll
sure, yeah.
So I didn't say anything to my mom or my little sister that I was, we were all three living together. And I just got on the Greyhound and fucking took off. It was insane. I had like no money. I was just stealing shit along the way. I mean,
right.
Shit.
And you're purportedly supposed to be in school somewhere.
Yeah, no, totally. Exactly. I'm like, I was supposed to be in school, and it's just not, it wasn't a good situation. So I left and stayed with them for a few months before I got a placement in a youth shelter in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And I stayed there for a period of time.
Back to Minnesota.
Yep, back to Minnesota. Stayed in the shelter for a little bit until I got into a transitional living program, which it's just like a subsidized apartment, essentially. It's a small building. I had, I think, 7 roommates or something like that. And we were all supposed to have jobs. And our rent was based on our income. So they would take like 25% of our earnings, and that was our rent, which was great.
Let me ask you 2 questions.
$5 an hour.
Right. Is the state protecting you from your father in terms of his attempts to still get custody? And what is the state doing about your education?
So at this point, after the court stuff was over with, like my dad had his legal parental rights severed, and everybody
That's
in
a relief
the community,
for you.
Yeah, big relief for me. The Indian community of the Twin Cities had essentially, blacklisted him. They were just like,
right,
no more. Like, this dude abused his kids, his family. He's crazy. Like,
right,
we don't want to see him around. And so he was gone, and I didn't see him again for the rest of my life.
Did he try to contact you, or was he just
no?
Gone off
Actually, in my 20s, I tried to contact him because I had always wondered what happened. And,
right, sure.
I have a moth story that's online that I talk about finding him.
Oh, okay. What would be the title of that if somebody wanted to see?
I usually just Google Bobby Wilson the moth.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and it's up there. But
I have a moth story, but it's not on the moth, but it's about a moth that flew into my ear, and I had to go to the hospital to get it out.
Oh no, that is one of my biggest fears. No.
Well, it happens.
Oh God, I can't.
So if you Google Dana Gould moth, I'll Google you. You
must be traumatized.
I was old enough that I was able to process it.
Oh God, I would sleep with those headphones on. It's like a phobia of mine. A sincere phobia. It's weird because it doesn't activate in the house. If I'm here, I'm fine. I don't give a shit. I'll sleep naked. I'll just, whatever. It doesn't matter. But if I'm on the road, if I'm in a hotel, I have this really strange fear that's based in nothing. Outside of, I saw a video.
It's all based in something. It's all based in something.
I saw a video once of a bug in a dude's ear, and then I heard a friend who had to go to the hospital and get a bug removed from his ear.
Well, it is. Now you know 2 people.
That was enough.
Now you know 2 people. The way they get it out is they soak a cotton ball with alcohol and they put it over your ear, and that dissolves that evaporates the oxygen and it suffocates. And then they flush it out.
Holy fuck!
And then
that I can do it at home.
My next regular doctor's appointment, which was months later, he was looking in my ear and said, "Did you have something in your ear?"
Oh no!
And I said, "Yeah," and it's because apparently written on my eardrum is "Human suck, moths number 1." No, but the dust from his wing, the dust, the sparkly dust from his wings was still in my ear. He goes, "Your ear's all glitter. You got a disco ear in here."
Beautiful in there.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I want to live there.
Yeah, I really love it in there.
Yeah, but no, I'm crazy phobic of elevators. I don't like being alone in an elevator, and that's I found out later in life that when I was 3 years old, my grandfather took me someplace and just left me in the car and went in the store, and I flipped the fuck out. I have no memory of it, but that's so it all goes back to something.
It must be. I do wonder. I mean, we lived, like I said, like we lived in tents. We lived in a motel. Who knows what crawled in my goddamn ear when I was a kid that I don't remember.
Sure. And the other members of do the other members of the 1491s, do you all, is your story atypical of the other membership, or does everybody
the others have pretty good relationships with their parents.
And it's like their version of like normal and yeah, I mean, what is the, you had the roughest ride.
Yeah. And
to adulthood. You had the roughest ride to adulthood of the other members of the group.
You know, I don't often tell them this, but I really do. They changed my life, this group of friends.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. You know, by my 20s, like life had been crazy. I had nothing to really fall back on. I was still going to jail for fighting or like graffiti stuff. And I met them in a time when I had already been kind of going through a life change. And I had a dear friend who I did some activism work with in my early 20s who died. She was hit by a car. And her mom took me as a son. And I moved in to her attic. And I kind of like, I was sort of there just to, I guess, help her process and grieve the loss of her child. And this was actually rooted in our cultural beliefs of, I guess, like when someone dies, someone close like that dies, then you maybe replacement is harsh, but you find a new family member. And I was a new family member. I moved in. It
sounds to me kind of healthy.
It was. I mean, like we went through her belongings. Like we went through different ceremonies, and this was like a year of us processing this death,
grieving.
Yeah. And smoking like a pack of Pall Malls a day on the porch, which
right.
About 15 years smoke free now, but
yeah.
So
that's not good for anybody.
No, it was crazy.
Yeah, but you're grieving. You're in pain.
We were in pain, and we were spending
people who are in pain medicate.
Yeah, it's fucking smoking a pack of cigarettes and drinking a pot of coffee on the porch.
Yeah.
And there came a time where I just, I had been running from so many unhealthy relationships. Your friends that
but you do, but that's normal because you only know unhealthy relationships. So unhealthy relationships are the things that feel comfortable.
Yeah,
it's like, hey, I know this.
And living with this woman,
I hate me, you hate me. This is perfect.
Yeah, we hate each other, even.
Of course,
we actually hate each other.
Yeah, that's right out of a textbook.
Yeah, and that's how we treated each other. And with the passing of this young woman in my life, I just made me examine what it is that I was doing. What am I? What is all of this? And I was going to ceremony with her mom and her family, and it just made me want to do something completely different. So I reached out to a dear friend of mine from Minnesota originally who had moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and I asked him. I knew he ran a printing shop. And I said, "Do you got any work?" I said, "I need to get out of Minnesota, man. I need to jumpstart my life somehow." And so he gave me a spot, and I slept in the back of his store for like nine months to a year around there, just bouncing on different people's couches. But I had a great time.
And you're how old now?
At that point, I was about 22, 23.
And what year is this about?
Oh, I don't know.
I have no idea how old you are. Like, is it early aughts?
I'm 36.
Okay, yeah. So
this is like 2008, maybe.
Right. Okay.
2007, 2008. Things are really happening like that. And but I was also the only Indian in Kentucky. It felt like every damn person that I met. I know you can't see it, but I got this long braid. I've got a fucking tomahawk and a peace pipe tattooed across my throat, and I've got a fucking profile like Crazy Horse Mountain. So a lot of people would come up to me and be like, "Are you Native American?" I'm like, "Yes, I am."
Yeah.
I've never met an Indian before. This is really something, and it's just like every single day, I was just like, okay, yes, great. You guys want to get coffee, or what do you want to do?
Yeah.
And so I really missed home, and I went back to Minnesota and just worked as an artist. And then I met the 1491s in that time period. And we became just so damn close. I had never been on a text thread with people, you know?
Right. Well, it's a search for a family. It's a search for a community where you feel that you belong and that you feel respected, because you didn't have that when you were supposed to have that.
Mm.
You know, that's supposed to be a given. And when it's not, you know, it's like a car without a carburetor. It's like, it's not going to run right till it gets a carburetor. And, you know, it's a quest for this fundamental building block of the human psyche that you didn't have. So that actually makes a ton of sense. And it's also, being the 1491s, I would assume, gave you an outlet to process your anger in a safe way.
Man, I know that's fucking right. Because I perceive,
because my comedy was very angry for different reasons. It's true. No, it's true. I had a fucked up feeling. I would lose to you, but it was fucked up enough to make me a comedian. And my comedy was very angry, and I'm assuming also, like you, it wasn't until I had my own family that I really, like, I was able to, like, identify the wound, medicate the wound properly, process the wound, but the wound didn't really start to heal until I had my own family, and I was able to see this is the road that I went down. I'm going to do this, and I'm sure you feel this too. Like, providing for your child is so, to see the cycle break.
Mm-hmm. It's paramount. I don't want her to know those things. And,
exactly.
I think about, like, what age am I going to tell her about my life before, you know? Because I don't know if she'll even fucking believe it, you know?
Sure.
Because I'm a different human being than I was in those eras. I mean, we all are, right? We go through these eras of life and we change.
Yeah, it's like chapters in a book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, the thing that I always would say I'm most proud of is that my kids aren't afraid of me.
No shit.
Yeah, but to me that's really important. Like,
absolutely.
My dad would come home from work and we would scatter.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Where are the 1491s now? You've had COVID for a year, so no one's working. Did you guys do videos during you working on you've got a show on FX? What's the state of the 1491s right now?
You know, it all felt like real happenstance in a real positive way. So, like, we were like, we wrote a play together for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival called Between Two Knees, and that's where we first met Kliph Nesteroff. He flew up and watched it and wrote about it a bit in the book.
Kliph, solid citizen,
that guy loves old-timey signs.
He's great. Yeah. He's the best. Well, as do I. Yeah. He's great.
Yeah, he's a good dude, man. And so he came up and
Canadian.
Unfortunately, you know, I look past that.
all the rudeness you'd expect from a Canadian.
I think they're so great. So we wrote that play, and my wife was pregnant at the time with our daughter. But I was the only one that didn't have a job. And so I stayed for the rehearsal process doing rewrites for an entire month and a half. And man, it was exactly what I had always kind of wanted to do with the comedy stuff. Like, my favorite part about creating comedy with these guys was when the five of us would just sit around and bullshit. We would just watch movies, we would make each other laugh, and we would be and we would integrate all of these things into our work. And being there for like a month and a half, it felt like that same experience, but for, you know, a month and a half straight. You know, we had this dedicated creative space, and I fucking loved it, and I wanted more of it. And so I didn't quite know what to do. I never went to college, but there was.
Did you get your GED?
I got my high school diploma when I was 20.
Good for you.
Yeah, I was still taking classes at the high school that I was that I had gone to when I started. I think I was 16, but yeah, I finished school and never went to college, but had a really great time in the arts. And a lot of successful artists that I had known were like, you really don't need art school. You just, as long as you put in the work and like keep doing what you're doing, you'll be fine.
It's true.
And it turned out that was true. So
yeah,
and
but you have to do the work.
You have to do the work.
Some people don't think they need to do either.
Okay, no, that's right, man. I've seen so many talented homies that just like think that it needs to be just dropped in your lap because you can put a brush onto a canvas. It's like. Yeah. No, you got to do more than that. It's all, you got to treat it like a goddamn job. This is your life.
We all know people like
just do it. Anyway,
it's so funny. I
was like that in my 20s, but I was also mad. So
I just printed this up. I'm putting it on my refrigerator. It's a quote from Rod Serling, and it says, "Coming up with ideas is the easiest thing in the world. It's putting them down that's hard."
It is, man. That's
so true.
The challenge of it. But no, so like the 1491s, we were with that play. And then while we were doing the rehearsal stuff, Taika Waititi called Sterling, sitting right next to me. And he said, "Hey man, that show that you and me thought would be a fun idea. I just sold it to FX. So we're going to have a show. We got to write the pilot." And I just remember,
and that's Reservation Dogs.
Yeah, that's Reservation Dogs. And he was like fucking, he like looked at me and he got up and he left out the room. I was like, no, whatever. Like he gets a phone call. He always does this. And he came back and he told me like, "Remember that show idea that I was telling you about?" And I was like, "Yeah, the Reservation Dogs one." He said, "Fucking Taika Waititi just sold it to FX. We're going to write the pilot." So holy fuck, dude! Congratulations! Like that was wild. And he like flew out the next day because he was like, "I gotta put all my effort into this." And thank goodness he did because it's going to be a crazy show. But
tell us about what is the show? What can you tell us at this point?
It follows like 5 kids on a reservation or in Oklahoma who
kids.
They're kids. They're like high school kids. Mm-hmm. And they decide that they're going to start fighting crimes, but they themselves are criminals. But they're like petty criminals, so they're just trying to figure out what the morality is, And they get into all sorts of fucking hilarious adventures. It's a great cast too. I don't know if I hope. I'm not going to mention it. I'm not going to mention who all's in it, but there's some really great heavy hitters in the series.
Yeah, well, Taika can probably pull in anybody he wants. So.
That's true. That is true. He can kind of do whatever the fuck he wants with his life.
Right.
But no, it's a fucking great show. It's so funny, and Sterling made such an insane effort to like they're filming in Oklahoma. That is so fucking hard to get a studio to agree to
go to Oklahoma.
Go to Oklahoma, unless it's like a major motion picture. Like it's funny is like Scorsese
like Oklahoma
right now. Yeah, like Oklahoma.
I don't think Oklahoma was filmed in Oklahoma.
No, I'm pretty sure it was that filmed at Paramount.
Yeah.
No, there's a simultaneously Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio are making an Oklahoma movie. While Sterling and Taika are filming their series, like
how weird,
a few miles away. Yeah, so funny. So like all these powers of Hollywood have descended upon Oklahoma. At the same fucking time. Yeah, I don't know if you've been. Have you been to Oklahoma?
I don't think I have.
I'll tell you what.
I've been to Nebraska,
Tulsa, Oklahoma. Ugh, don't. Let's. I'm gonna forget you said that. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a really fascinating hotspot for the arts. I feel like it's what people used to say Austin, Texas is.
Okay.
Like when it was at the height of its art.
Right.
And it's such an unexpected thing for people because, you think of Oklahoma, you think of the South, you think of, the Dust Bowl and all these things.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
It seems like Trump country, and it is.
It is. But out of that comes a reaction always.
Absolutely. And the reaction is fucking beautiful. It is wild, like underground country music. Like I'm not a fucking country fan. I don't give a shit. I hate the
whole genesis of it is antithetical to.
It's terrible. Yeah. And I had.
You're not the hero of any of those songs.
other podcasts reach for the sky. Dana Gould bound.
We barely try.
This has been the Dana Gould Hour, brought to you by the Internet. Music by Andy Paley, with Jake Posner behind the board. Produced by Jeff Fox. Graphic design and web production by Spencer Hunt and Segan Friend. Sound editing and post-production by Jalinda Palmer and Joe Napolitano.
Hey, if you like the show, why don't you drop us a line at show@danagould.com. Tom Kenny speaking.
I'm a DJ, I'm a person, I'm a singer, I love to sing and DJ. Boom! Peace out. You want me? Peace out. Boom.